I thought it might be an idea to have a look at and discuss these two old British off-road thumpers that we have here, and I've ridden both of them in videos off-road in my various off-road adventures with friends and whatever, as well as on the road locally on the lanes. And I've got to admit, I love both of these bikes to bits, but they're very, very different, and they go about similar jobs in very different ways. And if you look at the Tiger Cub and this particular sort of era of Enfield, although it's not dead original, the engine and the frame are only separated by a couple of hundred numbers on the Royal Enfield, and it dates from 1955. The Tiger Cub roughly loosely dates from 1965, or has specifications of machines from about that sort of period. So roughly speaking, you can say there's 10 years that separate these two. And although I built the Bullet with my father as a green laner, it was never built that way by the factory. It's just built from a road bike actually. Royal Enfield did build similar things. The Triumph is more representative of what Triumph actually made. I built that one closer to the specs of some of their off-road Tiger Cubs. And the Royal Enfield probably produces about 25 brake horsepower. If I remember rightly, I think that'll be at about 5,250 RPM. The Tiger Cub, that's interesting. The first Tiger Cubs were claimed or quoted as producing 10 brake horsepower. Sports versions were reckoned on producing 14.5. This one hasn't got the camshaft or the high compression piston of the sports model, but it has got a bigger inlet port and a bigger inlet valve than the 10 horsepower quoted variants began life with. And I also did a bit of porting work on the head on this one, and if we use the 10 horsepower and the 14.5 quoted by Triumph for the sports and the ordinary ones, I would put this one perhaps capable of producing around 12 horsepower. So let's say that the Bullet has twice the horsepower of the Tiger Cub, but to offset that, the Bullet is at least half as heavy again as the Tiger Cub. The Tiger Cub would be about 220 pounds, or around about 100 kilograms or a little over in weight. I read up on the Royal Enfield Bullet of this period being about 350 pounds in weight, which admittedly that would be with lights and a battery and heavier mudguards, steel rims rather than alloy. So let's say that we've got 300 against 220, or perhaps even 300 against 200, because even the Tiger Cub has got some lighter parts on it than it would have originally had. So power to weight ratios probably is still sort of perhaps up on the deal a little bit on the Enfield, possibly, but then the Tiger Cub is a lot more nimble. And then we've got to factor in the gearing as well. Now the Tiger Cub was supposedly 10 horsepower at 6,000 RPM, so that's 750 more than the Bullet to reach its peak power. And the gearing on these, the Enfield is actually geared pretty near standard, apart that it's got an 18-inch rear wheel instead of a 19, but it has got a 418 tyre instead of a 350 section that would have been on a 19 rim. So the gearing is very close to a standard road going Redditch 500 Bullet of the period. And the Trials Cub replica got that slightly higher geared than one of the variants that Triumph produced. I think the Trials Cub had a 16-tooth gearbox sprocket going into a 54 on the rear, but there were all sorts of variations. You could go right up to 64 teeth on the rear and down to about 13, I think, on the gearbox sprocket. So all sorts of, Triumph had lots of stuff to sort of adapt these bikes from one particular sport to another, and probably more so perhaps than the Enfield. But both manufacturers did compete competing off-road events, and they made machines that could be bought over the counter. And it's interesting to ride these two, and like I say, off-road, I've decided recently that I prefer the Trials Cub. That could be down to purely the gearing actually, because first gear on the Trials Cub as it is a lot lower obviously than first gear on this Royal Enfield, which is largely standard road going gearing. But the Royal Enfield has got heaps and heaps of torque, and it can pull so hard it actually started ripping the knobbles out the centre line of the previous tyre that I had on this one, and I'm going to be keeping an eye on this tyre and see how it goes as well. Now the Trials Cub certainly wouldn't do that, but the problem is that when you get on some of these rougher off-road sections, the actual speed you're going over the ground sort of overloads the suspension and makes it rather difficult to stay on and control the machine. So from that point of view, the Cub wins, because I can literally go slower on that and have more control over the engine than I've got on the Enfield. And the flip side of that is, out on the road obviously, the Tiger Cub is probably running out of puff as it sort of gets somewhere between 55 and 60 miles an hour on the gearing it's got. It's not going to do a hell of a lot more than that, although luckily it does seem to be able to sort of cruise along very close to its top speed, certainly between 50 and 55 are no problem for it. But the Enfield can go beyond 75, so there's quite a difference there when you're out on the open road and perhaps mixing it with the traffic. But swings and roundabouts, really, they've got their advantages over each other and their disadvantages over each other. But if the Enfield could rev as much as the Tiger Cub when it's going flat out, you'd probably find that the Enfield would be doing about 100 miles an hour if you could rev it that high. So quite a different sort of machine and different character, both of them. And incidentally, they've both got the same size wheels. I think I've got a fatter front tyre on the Enfield, but they're both 21 inch on the fronts, and they're both 18s on the rears, and 418 on the rear at that. And the Tiger Cub, you can only just about get a cigarette paper between the swing arm and the side wall of the tyre on the offside, and likewise between the side wall of the tyre and the chain guard on the near side. That is the absolute maximum, and I think next time when I put another tyre on this, I might go back down to a 350/18 just to have a little bit more room there. But very interesting, very enjoyable bikes. Both of them have got reasonable suspension. The rear shocks on the Tiger Cub have got more give and travel, perhaps a little bit more than the original ones would have had. And the Enfield definitely has, because I only changed them fairly recently. But still feels like it would be quite easy to get out of control on the Enfield and perhaps end up becoming a perler, just due to the sheer weight of it and the speed even in first gear compared to the Tiger Cub, which is far more manageable and a little more confidence inspiring, until you go through deep water and then follow that shortly afterwards with a steep downhill bit and find you've got no brakes. The Enfield will at least hang on to its front brake. It seems to be more sort of capable of maintaining its working, shall we say, after going through deep water than the Tiger Cub one. Mind you, I think there's less likelihood of water going in there, to be honest, than there is this one. But there we are, two old British iron thumpers, like I say, theoretically separated by about 10 years, 1955 there, and 1965 there, both very enjoyable. I like the pair of them, but both very different, and sometimes though it feels like it would just be a matter of tossing a coin as to which one I go out on, or perhaps which one's nearest the door. But both great bikes, both great fun, and I'm so glad that I got both of them to enjoy and compare and look after, even if I don't keep them perhaps as clean as some people might think I should. The Tiger Cub had a good wash after our recent outing, but obviously I must have put the Enfield away without doing so, so I'll have to give that a clean soon. But there we are, we'll leave it there. Royal Enfield Bullet 500, Triumph Tiger Cub 200.